Welcome on behalf of the Bloomington Bach Cantata project to the continuation of our 11th season. I'm Dan Malamed, director. We present cantatas of Johann Sebastian Bach in performances modeled on Bach's own. We're a project of the Bloomington community, of Bloomington early music, and of the historical performance and musicology departments at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. Our work is made possible by generous financial support from the Bloomington Arts Council and the Bloomington Urban Enterprise Association, and from our individual donors. We are determined to keep Bach cantatas going in Bloomington. We'll present recorded concerts until it's safe for us all to gather again. Our performances, including September's presentation of Cantata 47, are available on our YouTube channel. Please consider liking and sharing this video and following us on Facebook. Help us get the word out. Expenses are substantially higher this season because of the need to present in this way. If you're able and would like to support our work, information on donating to us is in the notes below this video, on our Facebook page, and in the concert program also linked below. And in that program you'll also find the text and translation of today's work and a list both of the performers and of our generous donors. Our routine is to hear a performance of the cantata, a short talk about the work, and then a second performance. Second performances are never quite the same, even if only because we hope you will hear it differently. J.S. Bach's Cantata 12, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen, dates from his first regular responsibilities to compose church cantatas, partway through the time he worked at the court at Weimar, around the year 1714. Now, this is a modern work in a couple of senses. It reflects Bach's encounter with the music of Antonio Vivaldi in that the syntax and organization of many of its movements are strongly influenced by Vivaldi's compositions. It's also a modern in the sense that it reflects the new model of cantata libretto, of cantata text. That is, it combines chorale stanzas, for example in our last movement, scriptural passages, our third movement, and newly written poetry in our fourth, fifth, and sixth movements. A modern work, but old-fashioned in some senses. Old-fashioned in its soloistic opening symphonia, really a slow sonata movement for oboe. Old-fashioned in its North German string ensemble of 2 violins and 2 violas. Compare that to the more Italianate modern combination of 2 violins and 1 viola. And old-fashioned in its approach to aria writing. But old-fashioned as it might have been in some respects, it was still modern enough that Bach could reuse it in Leipzig. There he incorporated it into his first annual cantata cycle in his first year there, 1723-1724. A performance he re-engineered to accommodate the different performing pitch used in Weimar compared to Leipzig. What he ended up doing was make it sound at the same pitch in Leipzig as it had in Weimar, but to do that, he had to arrange for it to sit differently on the instruments. So this version of the cantata has a distinct sound, and that's what we're doing here, Bach's Leipzig version of this piece. The liturgical occasion for this cantata was the third Sunday after Easter, known as Jubilate Sunday. And Jubilate Sunday was named for the introit antiphon for the Latin Mass for the day, Jubilate Deus omnis terra. And that's a reminder of the persistence of liturgical chant even in Latin, even in Lutheran worship. Now, of course, I want us to talk about this cantata, but we need to deal with something else first. And the first thing that most people want to tell you about this cantata concerns its opening vocal movement. You probably know its music because Bach used it about 35 years later, the music to which we have heard the text Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen, Bach reuses as the crucifixus of the B minor Mass. But, of course, neither he nor anybody else knew that on hearing the piece in 1714 in Weimar, and neither he nor anybody else knew that in 1724 in hearing the piece in Leipzig, or, in fact, as far as we can tell, ever recognized that during Bach's lifetime. We are best off leaving aside the crucifixus if what we want to do is try and understand this cantata. Now, Jubilate Sunday fell in the 50-day period between Easter and Pentecost, marking, of course, the reappearance of Jesus to his disciples. The gospel readings during this time are largely from John's gospel, full of doctrine. The reading for this day is central, in fact, to understanding Bach's cantata, and I can illustrate that with the first vocal movement. It begins Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen, Angst und Not, a list of near synonyms, all for lamenting. And it calls these the Christian's bread of tears. The affect in the text of sorrow and lament could not be clearer. This is, of course, reflected in Bach's musical setting, with sighing figures with which these words are expressed. Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen. Distributed voice by voice, one word at a time, a most unusual way to set a piece of poetry. It emphasizes the fact that this is a list of words, a list of near synonyms. It's musically reflected in the bass line of Bach's movement, with its descending partial scale by the smallest possible steps, the so-called lament bass. And it's the same bass line as another famous vocal work, this one from the end of the 17th century, Dido's Lament, When I Am Laid in Earth, from Purcell's setting of the opera Dido and Aeneas. This is a pattern that traces back well into the 17th century. Bach's bass, this lament bass, also repeats continuously every 4 measures, also characteristic for a lament. And this combination of descending lament bass line and repetition is often combined with a slow triple meter. Again, you can compare Dido's aria, which works in the very same way. We hear this descending lament bass 6 times for the text Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen, 5 times for the phrase that begins Angst und Not, and then once more for a total of 12 in one instrumental cycle to close that part of the piece. The text-music relationship is clear. The music reflects lament. But the movement then takes a surprising turn. The lamenting part, marked lento, closes quite firmly, and then Bach sets the last line of this poetic text separately, die das Zeichen Jesu tragen, those who bear the mark of Jesus, before then repeating the entire opening section, A, B, A, a piece done from the top, da capo, just like an aria. In fact, this is a da capo aria for 4 voices. That second middle section is very different. It's marked a little faster or a little happier, depending on how you want to translate the word. It's got a new relationship of voices to each other. They are far more unified now. It has a new relationship of voices to instruments. The instruments now double the voices. And a new relationship of notes to syllables. This part is much more florid, many more notes for each syllable of text. The triple meter of the repeating bass lament now becomes dance-like. In other words, this middle portion of our A-B-A da capo aria contrasts in every way, including, of course, in affect, in emotional significance. Clearly sorrow, and then joy, and then back to sorrow. This is musically very satisfying, but it's difficult to make sense of in relation to the text. That text does not look as if it were meant to be set A-B-A at all, let alone A-B-A with a strong affective contrast between the 2 parts. It's not even clear, in fact, that there are 2 parts to this text. The second part, die das Zeichen Jesu tragen, isn't a sentence. It doesn't even work grammatically on its own. Yet Bach has said it this way, evidently for maximum contrast of affect between the 2 sections. That's another old-fashioned feature, incidentally. The late 17th and early 18th century had a love for extreme changes of affect, for moving, literally, the affections, moving from one affection to the other. Bach clearly manipulates the text to make this happen. But why would he do this? As promised earlier, I think we need to think about the gospel reading for the day to understand it, just as the congregation would have, having heard it just a few moments before, both read and explicated in a sermon. The gospel reading for the day is from John, and it quotes Jesus saying to his disciples, "In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me." A clear antithesis. This, but then that. John then finds reason to repeat this by having the disciples ask, what does he mean by saying, "In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me"? And then he has Jesus answer, "You ask what I mean by saying, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me.'" It's clearly the intention of the evangelist here to repeat this and to stress the contrast between the 2 halves of this statement. And the answer to this that Jesus gives builds on this very contrast, but it's expressed in affective, in emotional terms. You will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth has pain, but she forgets the anguish because of her joy. Now is your time of grief, but you will rejoice. Now, other cantatas that Bach performed for this same occasion, Jubilate Sunday, reflect this. The next year, his own Cantata 103 has a text that begins, "Ihr werdet weinen und heulen, aber die Welt wird sich freuen." And that's one of the lines we just heard. You will grieve while the world rejoices. And in 1726, the year after that, he performed a cantata by his cousin Johann Ludwig Bach, whose text begins, "Die mit Tränen sehen, werden mit Freuden ernten." That's a psalm text that begins, "Those who sow in tears will reap in joy." All affective contrasts to begin these pieces. And this kind of contrast is all over our cantata text, over the text of our Cantata 12. In movement 4, cross and victory wreaths are bound together, contest and prize medal are united, Christians have their sorrow and enemy, but Jesus' wounds are their comfort. Movement 5 mentions both in well-being and in affliction, in life and in pallor, meaning death, and then in the sixth movement, after rain, blessing blooms. This contrast is even implied in the scriptural dictum, in the scriptural prose quoted in movement 2, in movement 3, to enter into the kingdom of God, we must go through much tribulation. There's an implied contrast of the same kind there. Now, the trajectory of the libretto overall is pretty clear, from tribulation and lamenting in the first vocal movement to the passing of trials and sorrow through the believer's faith in Jesus. But now we can see that Bach does something slightly different with his cantata text. He finds a way to project affective contrast from the very beginning, even though the text of the first vocal movement doesn't really suggest it. He musically signals this governing idea in the gospel and reading of the cantata, this idea of contrast, especially affective contrast, by having a contrasting middle section of his opening vocal movement created from the last line of text. And now, by the way, maybe we can see one reason it's problematic for us to be concerned with Bach's later use of this music in the Crucifixus in the B minor Mass, if what we're interested in is Cantata 12. For one, the later Mass version, you might recall, doesn't reflect the most interesting feature of the opening, in which the words of the first line, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen, are broken up one word to each voice, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen. This is distinctive, as I mentioned, unconventional, and a highly expressive gesture. The Crucifixus version just repeats that word in each voice. Crucifixus, 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 Crucifixus. At the least, this represents a different approach for a different text, meaning that each of these pieces needs to be taken on its own terms. Even more significantly, you might recall, the Crucifixus uses just the lament section of this opening vocal movement from Cantata 12. Bach entirely eliminates the B section, and with it the affective contrast. That might be the most important feature of Bach's musical invention in Cantata 12. It's a different piece. We don't need the cantata to appreciate the Crucifixus, and I would say we don't need the Crucifixus to appreciate the later Mass movement when we get to it. We need to take each on its own terms. Now, there's another place in Cantata 12 where Bach does something very similar. That is, musically bring an affective contrast to a text setting in which it's not entirely obviously present. The third of the three arias begins with the text Sei getreu, and its place near the end of the cantata suggests a positive place in the cantata's overall trajectory. Its message suggests this: pain is brief, storms pass. But Bach's setting is quite dark. It's in a minor key. It conventionally expresses dark sentiments by gestures in the voice. It emphasizes the word alle Pein, all pain, in paradoxically stretched out, tortured settings of that word and of ein kleines, a little while. Now, it's difficult to see from the libretto how this emphasis on the dark element here of a text that tells you that pain is brief and that storms will pass. It's difficult to see how that emphasis makes sense. But the answer, once again, isn't in the text, it's in the musical setting. Now, this is a so-called basso continuo aria, in that it calls just for voice and the basso continuo instruments, here organ, cello, and violone. But there's another participant here as well, a trumpet. And the trumpet plays a chorale melody phrase by phrase. This chorale melody makes itself very strongly felt in the aria. The tune even turns out to govern the musical organization of this movement. Now, there always seems to be a reason for the selection of a tune, even when that tune is performed instrumentally without the words you usually expect to have in a chorale setting. It presumably brings some element of its text with it. Well, that's probably the case here, but what verse of the hymn from which Bach draws this tune? Maybe it stanza 2 of the hymn, lines that read, "Under your protection I am set free from the storms of every foe. Even though it now thunders and flashes lightning, Jesus will shelter me." That is, it could borrow this verse or refer to this verse by reference to the storm mentioned in the aria text. Or maybe it refers to stanza 6 of this hymn, which has a line that goes, "Elend, Not, Kreuz, Schmach und Tod," misery, distress, affliction, disgrace, and death, just like the list at the beginning of our cantata. But most likely what Bach is invoking here is the first stanza, if you will, almost the name of the tune, Jesu meine Freude, Jesus my joy. And this implied text, Jesus my joy, stands in contrast, in unspoken but clearly heard contrast, to the pine, the pain of the aria text. If this is right, that we have here another strong contrast of affect, made entirely musically, here by reference to the text associated with a chorale tune. And once again, it's worth remembering this is entirely Bach's doing. You would not know this from just reading the libretto. Now, it's easy to imagine that a cantata's meaning lies essentially in its text, and that the job of the composer is to express, to realize that meaning by an appropriate musical setting. But we can hear, with the example of Cantata 12, that a big part of a cantata's message can lie in the music and in the relationship that music bears to things in the text. And that gives us potentially a whole new way to listen to this work.
sein Kreuz umfassen, ich küsse Christi Schmach, ich will sein Kreuz umfassen.